No document in world history so changed the world for the better as did the Ten Commandments.
The Ten Commandments weren't historical, they're mythical, because they never existed. And neither did Moses, and neither does God. None of that is evidently real. Even rabbinical scholars now admit a consensus among archaeologists that the Exodus never happened, because the Hebrews were never enslaved in Egypt the way the Bible describes. Moses' childhood river arc was taken from the saga of Sargon, and the parting of the Red Sea was adapted from the legend of an Egyptian pharaoh from an earlier millennia. Belief in the Ten Commandments never changed anything for the better, either. Most of the believers professing to promote them can't even recite them and never knew what they meant.
Western civilization, the civilization that developed universal human rights, created women's equality, ended slavery, created parliamentary democracy, among other unique achievements, would not have developed without them.
If that were true, then all this progress would have come about thousands of years ago and not just in the last century or so. But each of the advances you cited were made only recently, after the Enlightenment and in spite of the commandments. Because those commandments are authoritarian, not democratic. They allow special privileges for one race over all others, they permit and endorse slavery, and they treat women as property. So for these unique achievements to have occurred at all, the commandments would have to be ignored or discarded first.
As you will see when each of the Ten Commandments is explained, these commandments are as relevant today as when they were given over 3,000 years ago.
They weren't given then. That story was made up much later. The commandments you're talking about aren't just a set of 10 either. There are 11 commandments just in Exodus 20, and that list continues through the next 3 chapters, with many being ethno-specific and limited to the regional currency of sheep and shekels. It wasn't even relevant then, and it has no parallel in the American legal system now, especially since we've freed the slaves, allowed women their own agency, and defied the commandments by rejecting theocracy, permitting freedom of religion, and prohibiting discrimination on the basis of race, creed, or national heritage.
In fact, they're so relevant that the Ten Commandments are all that is necessary to make a good world, a world free of tyranny and cruelty.
Except that back when nearly everyone in the Western world was ruled by religions touting these commandments, it was a period of unparalleled tyranny and cruelty known as the Dark Ages. It was a time of thought police, when one could be killed simply for not believing what they were told. The first half of your list of 10 only served to promote religion, with no benefit to humanity at all. Education, enlightenment, and free inquiry are the key, not the forced conformity by those claiming authority from an imaginary being.
Imagine for a moment a world in which there was no murder or theft. In such a world, there would be no need for armies or police or weapons. Men and women and children could walk anywhere at any time of day or night without any fear of being killed or robbed.
Yet it's not like that in the Old Testament, is it? Even after the part with the Ten Commandments, we still have God's self-appointed prophet ordering his armies of barbaric thieves to pillage villages, killing every man, woman, and child. But ironically, some predominantly atheist countries in the modern world have finally achieved that sort of peaceful society with high education and very low crime, and the greatest threat to that comes from religious fundamentalists.
Imagine further a world in which no one coveted what belonged to their neighbor. A world in which children honored their mother and father and the family unit thrived. A world in which people obeyed the injunction not to lie. The recipe for a good world is all there in these 10 sublime commandments.
If that were true, then the trends we're seeing would be exactly opposite of what they are. If you were right, then the world would have been less cruel thousands of years ago than it is today, and we wouldn't see all these improvements in our condition coming so late in history or accelerating in recent times. As our world becomes more secular, we would not see the consistent decline in inhuman atrocities that we have, nor the unprecedented rise in humanitarian compassion that continues today.
But there is a catch. The Ten Commandments are predicated on the belief that they were given by an authority higher than any man any king, or any government. That's why the sentence preceding the Ten Commandments asserts the following: God spoke all these words.
Actually, before the Bible ever labels the Ten Commandments for the first time in Exodus 34, it says that Moses was taking dictation, even though God said that he would write that second set himself. The commandments you're referring to are not the set that the Bible calls the Ten Commandments. What you're referring to is actually a much longer list, which was reportedly destroyed by Moses. Then he went back up the mountain to get the second edition. In the story, God says that the second set would be exactly like the first, but only the first two remain the same, and this time they stopped at 10. Several of the new additions were not part of the first 10. There is no rule against stealing or murder or perjury in the second set, and the fourth commandment isn't about the Sabbath anymore either. Now it requires that all the firstborn children be killed on the altar as a sacrifice to God. The Bible is pretty specific about that, and it doesn't allow any way out of it.
You see, if the Ten Commandments, as great as they are, were given by any human authority, then any person could say, "Who is this man Moses? Who is this king or queen? Who is this government to tell me how I should behave?"
Who is this God? The God of the Jews? Those who say they're God's chosen people? And what are these commandments? The covenant between God and Israel? And why only Israel? Because neither their God nor their fables were ever intended for the whole of mankind. It is the folklore of one particular tribe of superstitious primitives, and it is meaningless to us here and now, especially since your God never even existed. So these laws were given by men, after all.
Okay, so why is God indispensable to the Ten Commandments? Because, to put it as directly as possible, if it isn't God who declares murder wrong, murder isn't wrong. Yes, this strikes many people today as incomprehensible, even absurd.
Yes, it is absurd. Because even according to your sacred fables, Moses murdered an Egyptian and then looked around to make sure no one saw him before he tried to conceal the body. And the same goes for the myth of Cain and Abel, where Cain lied about killing his brother. Both of these characters obviously already knew that murder was wrong a long time before the story of the Ten Commandments. And this might be because Hammurabi had already established the code of law many centuries earlier than these myths found their way into the Bible. Or it might be that, like most social animals, even superstitious savages understood that you shouldn't kill or maim other members of your own society, unless your religion commands it. One minute God supposedly says, "Thou shalt not kill," and the next minute he orders his own people to kill every man and his brother, except, of course, for Moses' brother, who really should have been the only one that was killed in that story, but somehow he was spared and promoted to priest instead, saved by nepotism. Then God told them all to kill all their neighbors, every man, woman, and child, including the infants and the unborn. But the fact is that murder is still wrong, regardless what God has to say about it. And there is still no justification when God allegedly commands his prophets to plunder communities and commit genocide.
Many of you are thinking, is this guy saying you can't be a good person if you don't believe in God? Let me respond as clearly as possible. I am not saying that. Of course there are good people who don't believe in God, just as there are bad people who do.
But the good people will still go to hell, no matter how good they are, simply because they don't believe. And bad people can still get into heaven because they believe. I would say that your God is a very poor judge. A just and fair judge would look at our actions, not our beliefs. Thus it should be that good-hearted atheists could be rewarded over dark-hearted believers, but then no God worthy of worship would damn anyone to eternity either. This is just one of many indications that it is not God making these judgments, but rather the people pretending to speak for him. They're using the stick and the carrot to intimidate people into giving them credence and paying them tithe while reinforcing a shared delusion.
And many of you are also thinking, I believe murder is wrong. I don't need God to tell me. Now, that response is only half true. I have no doubt that if you're an atheist and you say that you believe murder is wrong, you believe murder is wrong. But forgive me, You do need God to tell you. We all need God to tell us. You see, even if you figured out murder is wrong on your own, without God and the Ten Commandments, how do you know it's wrong? Not believe it's wrong, I mean know it's wrong.
Easy. We can tell that murder is wrong because we have objective criteria by which we can determine for certain whether murder is wrong, and we can do that regardless what mood the gods are in that day. There has to be an objectively verifiable reason why something is moral or immoral, or else no one could know whether it is, including God, since the Bible has him changing his mind all the time. Without that criteria, you couldn't know what is moral or immoral either. You just have to trust whatever the people said who pretend to speak for God. But thank you for acknowledging that knowledge is something more substantial than belief, and that mere beliefs might well be wrong.
The fact is, you can't. Because without God, right and wrong are just personal beliefs, personal opinions. I think shoplifting is okay, you don't.
What is it about stealing that makes it something we ought not do? What do we need to look for in a given act in order to diagnose whether it's something we ought or ought not do? If we don't know how to tell whether a given thing is morally wrong, how can we know that it's morally wrong in the first place? Now, I ask this question of my detractors as a courtesy, but as far as I'm concerned, you can only decline to answer the question so many times before you forfeit your right to define your terms, at which point I'll be happy to do it for you. Here's what I understand the terms morally right and morally wrong to mean. A particular action or choice is moral or right when it somehow promotes happiness, well-being, or health, or it somehow minimizes unnecessary harm or suffering, or it does both. A particular action or choice is immoral or wrong when it somehow diminishes happiness, well-being, or health, or it somehow causes unnecessary harm or suffering, or again, it does both. And notice that nothing about this is subjective or relativistic. The fact that murder causes harm or that saving a life minimizes it is not a personal opinion that's only true for me. Harm, pain, suffering, health, well-being, these are real things. They're not contingent on my mind. I don't have to agree that you're dying for you to actually be dying. Bodies live and they die. Brains experience pain and suffering, and they experience joy and health. This is objectively measurable.
Unless there is a God, all morality is just opinion and belief. And virtually every atheist philosopher has acknowledged this.
As you've already been wrong about virtually everything you've said so far, I figured you're almost certainly wrong about this too, but just to make sure, I inquired of every prominent atheist philosopher I could. The summary consensus among them is that your assertion is asinine nonsense, that you're full of shit and you know it.
Another problem with the view that you don't need God to believe that murder is wrong is a lot of people haven't shared your view. And you don't have to go back very far in history to prove this. In the 20th century, millions of people in communist societies and under Nazism killed about 100 million people. And that doesn't count a single soldier killed in war. So don't get too confident about people's ability to figure out right from wrong without a higher authority. It's all too easy to be swayed by a government or a demagogue or an ideology, or to rationalize that the wrong you're doing isn't really wrong.
From police blotters, where the biggest motive for homicide is not just amoral predation, a mugger killing someone to steal his Rolex. The biggest categories of motives for homicide are moralistic. In the eyes of the perpetrator, of the murderer, it's capital punishment, killing someone who deserves to die because whether it's a spouse who's unfaithful or someone who dissed him in an argument over a parking space or cheated him in a deal. That's why people kill each other for moral reasons. That is true at large scales as well. If you were to tally up the largest episodes of bloodletting in human history, most of them would have moralistic motives. The Nazi Holocaust, Pol Pot, Stalin, the Gulag, Mao, the European wars of religion, the Crusades, all of them were killing people for not because they wanted to accumulate vast amounts of money or huge harems of women, but because they thought they were acting out of a moral cause. Indeed, one of the great trends over the course of history that I think has been responsible for the reductions of violence that I tried to document in The Better Angels of Our Nature is paring down the application of our morality and moral sense, working against some of the inclinations that are built into human nature to moralize authority and conformity and purity, to say really what we should attach our moral sense to, our moral emotions, is simply the maximizing of human flourishing and the minimizing of harm.
And even if you do figure out what is right and wrong, God is still necessary. People who know the difference between right and wrong do the wrong thing all the time. You know why? Because they can. They can because they think no one is watching. But if you recognize that God is the source of moral law, you believe that He is always watching.
Then why is it that convicted criminals here in the U.S. are overwhelmingly Christian?
Statistically, there's a negative correlation between religiosity and what we typically think of as moral behavior. I'm sure most of you have seen the polls estimating the population of convicted felons as overwhelmingly religious, whereas the number of atheists in the prison population are always much lower than the percentage amongst free-roaming citizens. It is not possible that a significant number of these majorities were secretly atheists until they were arrested and that they only converted to Christianity after indictment, but defenders of the faith have argued that. The factions of dominant religion typically have the highest crime rate with special emphasis on hate crimes, and that'll come up later. Religious people are more likely to condone the murder or torture of prisoners, where non-religious people are more likely to consider that morally wrong. But it gets worse. Am I on the right one? Okay. The most religious countries also have the highest murder rate, and the same is true of the most religious areas within the United States. The higher the religiosity of a given populace, the higher the murder rate. Secular nations show the opposite tendencies, where the less religious they are, the more peaceful they tend to be. Here in America, I always forget I'm not in America. Evangelical Christians have the highest divorce rate. They also have the highest rates of teen pregnancy, which isn't surprising, since they think abstinence only is an appropriate way to deal with sex education. I live in Texas, where the abstinence-only program has earned us the status of being the highest rate of repeat teen pregnancies. But it gets even worse. Fundamentalist Christians have a higher rate of abortions, a testament to their hypocrisy. This is what a colossal failure the policies of the religious right have always been. But it gets even worse than that. Child Protective Services and other agencies report a significant majority of child abusers and molesters identified as very religious, and the more religious they are, the worse offenders they are. Yet, religious people still argue that the less religious we are, the less moral we are, and that the more we abandon faith, the more violent we become, with the murder rates going up all the time. But that's not what's happening. And it doesn't take much research to see that.
So even if you're an atheist, you would want people to live by the moral laws of the Ten Commandments. And even an atheist has to admit that the more people who believe God gave them, and therefore they are not just opinion, the better the world would be.
Everything that guy just says is bullshit.
First of all, God's opinion is still an opinion, and the prophets of God are only expressing their opinions too. They're just claiming more authority than they actually have. Arguments from authority are worthless. You need to have a verifiable reason that can be determined objectively, regardless what anybody has to say about it, including God. Next, I noticed once again a recurrent theme wherein believers admit that whether we believe something somehow matters more than whether it is actually true, where the facts of the matter are somehow irrelevant, as if we're expected to believe things not because they're evidently or probably true, but because of some estimated consequence of disbelief. That may be the psychology of faith, but not of rational people. Having actually read all of the commandments listed from Exodus 20 through Exodus 34 and many of the other commandments strewn about the Old Testament, it is obvious that anyone who uses them as a moral guide would be a criminal in every country on this planet. The Bible does not promote morality. It only commands obedience to an amoral, oppressive, and unjustly enforced belief system. So I would rather people know the truth.
In 3,000 years, no one has ever come up with a better system than the God-based 10 Commandments for making a better world, and no one ever will.
The story of the Ten Commandments is clearly based on the earlier story of the Law Code of Hammurabi, which was a better list, and actually existed in real history centuries before the legends now attributed to Moses. Since then, people have come up with better documents, like the Magna Carta and the U.S. Constitution. These are better, largely because they stand against what your commandments represent, giving power to the people instead of indomitable despots.
I'm Dennis Prager.
And I'm Aaron Ra. Prager's video was supposed to be an introduction to his explanation of the Ten Commandments, but he doesn't even know what they are. So I offer my own explanation of both sets of them, and you're welcome to follow along in your Bibles to make sure I got it right.